if the material about the key ever gets written up, I can show that if you look at Strieber's visions of environmental catastrophe, how they evolve over time, it's always in reaction to some new knowledge that's appeared in the mainstream, which Strieber then takes and runs with, and totally appropriates and presents as if it's unknown, that no one's ever said this before. If you look at Nature's End, the basic disaster scenario there is, number one, overpopulation, and number two, runaway global warming. That, in a way, makes sense given its time, what was of concern at that point when the book came out. Now, that differs dramatically from the superstorm scenario that supposedly only became visible to the world with the conversation between Strieber and the master of the key. The first time this was ever mentioned that runaway global warming could actually counterintuitively result in the new ice age. Well, I have 2 articles in separate publications that appeared within 2 years of this supposed conversation in Toronto, in which this precise scenario was described. The way the currents slow down and stop, and then, the ice age forming as a result. And then, of course, if you look at some of Strieber's public comments in his journal and so on, between, let's say, 1996, when this was in Discover, a New Scientist, and 98, when the experience of Toronto happened, Strieber starts talking about ocean currents stopping and, the UK being plunged and losing its ability to be inhabited, and, potentially an ice age occurring. And then what do you know? That appears in the key. So Strieber has appropriated things that are appearing in the scientific mainstream. Sometimes he puts an even worse disaster spin on it, presents it, and he says, look, I'm bearing the warning. Number one, implicitly, is look how brilliant I am that I have such foresight. But number two, you have to listen to me because I'm the leader of the tribe, and I'm trying to protect you. And this is his whole thing, again and again and again. It's what he does, it appears.
Yeah, I mean, he does quite the track record with warnings of disaster to come. I remember at the time of the GFC, he did speak very loudly of the fact that the system was just right on the cusp of whole-scale collapse. He outlined some sort of spectacular scenario where interbank lending would completely break down, and of course the implication or the implied in his argument was that he had access to information not widely available, which informed his view. This is of a piece too of his presentation of the existence of covert Nazi force within the United States, which was set to bring about the end of American democracy and the promotion and establishment of a genuine outright Fourth Reich, which is fine, we can all get drunk and say silly things, but you do have to be honest with oneself and say, well, I don't actually understand these things of which I'm speaking. I don't actually understand the economy because I make this analysis. I posit and I suggest an outcome that doesn't come to pass. Therefore, my analysis was flawed. I don't see all the variables present. I don't understand the relationship between them. And what's wrong with that? I mean, that's a normal human reaction. No one expects you to be omniscient. We're all blind. We don't understand everything. I mean, it's just how it goes. But no, not Strieber. He's always omniscient. He always knows. He always has information. This is another part we haven't really spoken about, but I often find he implies he's information that you and I don't have, which gives his analysis that sort of breathless quality you find. But how many scenarios does he outline? Nazis in America, collapse of the economy, atomic bombs in Washington, on and on and on. but no, there's no sort of consideration. There's no looking over the shoulder saying, well, let's face it, there's a lot of things haven't happened the way I thought it would.
Well, you make an excellent point. It's absolutely dead on. I've noticed that myself, that sort of recourse to, I have data that you don't have.
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
thing. And
Honestly, as we speak, I can't recall an exact instance. It's more sort of a general feeling tone you find through his work, is that he doesn't sort of position things ambiguously. He just gives these ideas, and they're novel, and you can't find them anywhere else. But he sort of positions it to say, well, I know this. Trust me, I know this. I mean, of course, that's of his piece, of his claims to knowing Lyndon Baines Johnson and the warnings he apparently got before JFK's assassination and the like. But yeah.
Well, this is the issue that needs to be raised, I think, and that is the disingenuousness of Strieber. And this is something that only appears when you have studied Strieber and you've gone to such a point. I mean, it's not at all obvious, because this is a guy who, in order to grasp him, you pass through successive stages in a way. It's almost disgustingly Hegelian. So you start off, if you're unlucky, you just reject him outright. Let's say you belong to MUFON, or you belong to the Skeptical Inquirer, forum. He's just a charlatan, or he's delusional. So you've got your crass rejections of Strieber. Let's put those aside. Then, if you're somebody like us, presumably, you and I probably, when we first encounter Strieber's work, you see how vivid it is, and you see how a lot of it doesn't make sense, which is in a way like real life. Real life oftentimes is enshrouded in mystery, and even though you kind of get a sense of what something is, you aren't fully aware of what it is. You don't understand it completely. So you read Communion, and you have what really comes across like an honest, forthright accounting of some completely wild and strange set of experiences, which, if true, if that sort of thing can happen, it has massive implications for what human life is supposed to be about. So that's kind of how you enter into Strieber if you don't reject him stupidly outright. And then as you're dragged along the trail by Strieber, you really become convinced of his basic honesty. Even when he's totally credulous, even when he's contradicting himself, you think, well, whatever he's doing, he's not trying to lie to us, But then at the very end, once you've traveled far down the road, you begin to see hints of exactly what you just talked about, where you see, to some extent, Strieber must be consciously participating in the creation of this little thing that he does and what he is. Because, the recourse to the secret knowledge and information, talking about having a secret manuscript locked away, he said other things as well. He'll say something about the master of the key, like, well, I have a detailed physical description of him, which I wrote up and gave to my lawyer in case something should happen to me, or something along those lines. And at least one other instance of something like that as well. So you have, I have recourse to secret data you don't know about. I have had conversations with people you don't know about. He'll go 10 or 20 years talking about this von Neumann scenario, where von Neumann told the government, or said something to the effect that, well, we can't start talking about them because they'll become quantum mechanically real. But then only recently he'll say, oh, yes, and by the way, that five-page memo written by him happens to be the most classified document in the U.S. government.
I know.
Really?
I mean, yeah. I did.
So you have the guy constructing this. This is not consistent with complete honesty. So in a way, he's constructing for himself this more structured position of authority. When you realize that, you then suddenly, first thing is you think, well, if this guy is constantly going, woe is me, and having a public pity party and in tears about the mockery and so on. Now you begin to see how this is, to some extent, the result of his own efforts. It's not simply that he was this, Galahad type pure virgin who came forward and was, ridiculed by these awful, disgusting hordes of humanity. But if the guy is constructing this position for himself and he's using some bullshit in the process, well, then, to whatever extent he's bullshitting us, he actually also deserves the reaction that he's gotten because he's created for himself this position.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the other part of it is it strikes me Strieber actually is quite a poor understanding, I think, of the culture at large. I think Strieber is a poor understanding of society as it stands. By my reading, by my understanding, is that the vast majority of people have next to no interest in the subject, none. That tiny minority who have an interest, it's a flickering one. There's no deep commitment to the topic, to the study of the subject. And Strieber doesn't see this. And in part, he then misreads the popular response to him and his work in a very obvious fashion. He reads on to how the fact that his books don't sell, he comes up with this ridiculous idea that there's some sort of engineering at work. Whereas, what's the greater truth? People honestly don't care about the topic. They just do not care that much. And he fails to see that, which is an interesting thing about Strieber. He's almost quasi-autistic in some way, but...
Well, we all are when it comes to, I would say, the basis for our ego, quote unquote, our personality. Now, most of us don't externalize it or equate it with a public mission the same way Strieber does. But, for him, he would lose the basic centrality of his own self-identity if he had to, number one, abandon that everybody loved him, which he had to do, and he didn't turn into the king of the world. But number two, the fallback position is that everybody's out to get me.
Yeah, and even as we talk about this, where we're talking about Strieber as really the pathetic wretch, what we're talking about, these things we point to, this woe is me number, this misreading of the culture, his general very poor self-awareness. This, in a way, is fundamentally pathetic. If you came across this in a friend or an intimate, you try and shake them out of it. Or if you came across this in a colleague or an acquaintance, you'd have very little sympathy for it. But with Strieber, he pushes this a great deal, and I come back to, he was 12 years with the Gurdjieff Foundation. And in 12 years, the whole purpose of the work is to see yourself with the view that ultimately you become so sickened by what you see, your ego is broken. That's the Gurdjieff work in a sentence. Every exercise, every meeting is purpose to you learning more about yourself. You just see who you are. And this is not something I say as, look at Strieber, what an idiot, what a pathetic idiot. We're all that idiot. We're all pathetic in our ways. But he seems singularly unalive to it, which is at odds with the amount of time he spent with the foundation. That's why I suppose I keep coming back to this idea that all this ambiguity, this ambivalence, this strangeness, these inconsistencies, in a way it has to be purposed. I just can't, I find it incredible that he's so unself-aware, that he just doesn't say it is as he would have learned to see it, that in the performance of what's called the intellectual center, it's irregular and unharmonious. Surely he would see this. But no, he doesn't. And that's what I find so strange about the man. And, you know, I'm saying this really is, in a way, I'm throwing up my hands. I just don't know how to understand him.
Well, I'm with you. I've been in that boat for a couple of years now. I mean, you make an excellent point. How can the guy be in this group, the Gurdjieff Group, such as it is, and remain singularly immune to all of its effects? And to my mind, intuitively, I mean, when you suggested to me that people are not asked to leave, that it just simply doesn't happen, the fact that he went, that's what I associated with automatically. Not so much, although it's very possible, not so much that he was sent out to fulfill a mission, but that there was something about him that was basically incompatible.
That's the alternative explanation to the idea of a mission, is that he fundamentally, they told him, just like Strieber, really, you gotta fuck off. You just, that's what, but this actually makes sense now that we talk about it, now that I think about it, is that he is so self-important, yet lacking self-awareness. My experience of being in the work is that your exercises in keeping the question open, what you see is your own bullshit. You see your own subconscious patterns. That is the purpose of these exercises of self-remembering, is that what you begin to do is you pay attention to to ever greater amounts of your experience. So typically self-awareness, as you know, it sort of flickers in and out. You're aware of yourself at times, then you're in another situation where you lose your sense of self. Sort of in those contexts, subconscious or unconscious, subconscious rather, patterns manifest themselves. So for instance, you may have a sense of self-awareness. You walk into your office, you're dealing with your colleagues. As you deal with your colleagues, you lose your self-awareness, your attention flows out into the context of the conversation, and you're running patterns. You want to seduce the lady in your office. You want to, take a cut at the male in your office. You want to sort of reduce him. And that's the whole purpose in the exercises. Then you come back to your weekly meeting. You share what you see. And how you see it is that you actually learn to balance your attention into your body, and your attention is anchored in the body, which allows you to gather these impressions, which cumulatively generate a force. And this is the remorse of conscience, which is meant to break you. You're fundamentally meant to see the ugliness of your own egotism, is that you are actually devoid of those qualities you thought you had. You are actually fundamentally without compassion. You're fundamentally without intelligence. You're fundamentally a base, coarse being. This is the whole object of the Gurdjieff work. And then Strieber, he's supposedly in there for 12 years, and he just carries on the way he does. This is inexplicable to me. In my sense, in my experience in the work, is everyone who enters the work and stays beyond a meeting is sincere. The Gurdjieff had the tone of the work is of a ruthless self-consideration, a ruthless self-analysis. You are wholly responsible for your condition. It's nobody's fault but yours. And with that, then you have to learn to see that. You're not trying to change anything. That's a critical thing to understand about the work. You're not charged, you need to be loving, you need to be compassionate, you need to have equanimity. None of that. You have to see. You have to see. As Gurdjieff said, he said, you must first awaken, then you die, then you're reborn. And that's what Strieber, I don't see that trajectory at all. It's if he never awoke in 12 years. Everyone I've known who's involved in the work, they're very humane human beings. They would never say to someone in an argument, as Strieber recently said to Hull, we have to go head to head on that point. It's sort of just this sort of mannerism, which is, it's a mannerism approach you lose through the generation of self-understanding that comes with the work. You would never say that to somebody. You never wield your armored ignorance against someone with the view of, oh, we're going to go head to head, buddy, and I'm going to show you that I'm right. That sort of thing is just, that is like your day one, your day two within the work. You see these things about yourself and you release them. So this is the whole thing. I suppose the broader point I'm trying to really get at is, and I return to this, is I don't understand how Strieber was there for 12 years and he is who he is. Unless he just fundamentally was so incapable of actually seeing himself for who he was. They finally said, look, man, give it up. You know, just give it up. Because the people he worked with, Siegel was held in enormous high regard for very obvious reasons. He was an extremely developed human being, as within the context of the work. But they let him go. And you know, now as I even talk about it, I can talk about my own experience. Is that at one point when I was involved in the work, I was given repeated charge of exposition of very complicated, well, relatively the more complicated topics within the doctrine, if you like. Retrospectively, I see what the point was. It was to do for my propensity for exposition. It wasn't actually a reflection of any confidence in my abilities. It was more an exercise given that I would exhaust a certain propensity. And seeing that, I then wonder, was Strieber given charge of a group in order that he would sort of do with his need to be an authority? And I wonder then, it was just fundamentally they just gave up on the guy.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. You see, that's the interesting thing, is that there's another interesting element. I don't know how relevant this is, but the Gurdjieff work has a whole oral tradition. There's things that were never written, but they speak about. And just on that point, I remember a very good friend of mine, my closest friend, he later said to me, he said he was given charge of talking about other topics, but he felt like he got the primary school stuff, grade school stuff, I got the university stuff. But ultimately though, looking back, and I see now, it was purposed towards different things. So I then look at Strieber's own account of his experiences there and try and see what they were trying to do for him. And I have to repeat, and I insist on this point, I've never heard of anyone being asked to leave. But Strieber admits that. He said, they asked me to leave.
Well, so you detail very well this anomaly, not only with the excellent description of what the Gurdjieff work is, which is probably the best description I've heard to date, but also the anomaly of Strieber himself in relation to that. And instantly my mind, tries to formulate a theory to account for it. So I would start by saying that, there have been efforts online and in different places to link Strieber with psychosis, because psychosis, schizophrenia, even the term schizophrenia is supposed to mean divided mind or split mind, something along those lines. So when you realize that Strieber's experiences are fragmentary and there are these massive gaps, not only in his knowledge of what happens to him, but in his awareness of himself on a really kind of unique, fundamental level, then the first inclination people have, the first thing that they try to do is to see Strieber in terms of psychosis for one reason or another. That to me is a non-starter for reasons that we've discussed. In psychotic people, you don't have the kind of fullness of discourse, as it's called in psychoanalysis, where there are all of these unintentional slips that betray a kind of secret discourse. If you take a genuine psychotic and you stick them in front of a psychoanalyst and you ask them to free associate, you're not going to find any kind of repressed monologue going on underneath or behind the scenes. Basically, you find nothing but chaos and void. Whereas if you take a normal, quote-unquote, neurotic person and you let them free associate, they will maybe start to say things based on kind of idiosyncratic word choices that suggest that in the back of their mind, unbeknownst to them, there's something being thought about, something going on, which maybe they're actively repressing. You don't know. But the idea is that you don't find this kind of structuring in a genuine psychotic person. Now, Strieber is, in that regard, so normal as to be to be obscene. I mean, the comment that he made comes to mind about how easy he is to hypnotize. The fact that the guy will write a novel and make a main character model completely obviously transparently on himself, name another female character, Marla, who was a co-host on Dreamland at the time, and have his character say, oh, he really wants to fuck her, but do it in such a way that he himself is like totally unaware. It's as if he's capable not only of slips of the tongue in the ordinary sense, but that like slips of the page or slips. He writes entire books that are slips of the tongue. He can write entire passages. In that regard, he really has a totally loose grasp of what he's doing. Now, if you regard the ego in the ordinary sense as kind of like an accountant, somebody who keeps track in the ledger, the person keeping track in the ledger and that ledger combined are the ego in a certain way. You know, I'm aware of what I'm doing. What does that mean? That means I can articulate and justify to the outside world what I'm doing at any given moment. This is the ego. Well, his ego really seems to be floating above the landscape and touching down only here and there. And he doesn't know what's going on frequently. These gaps in his self-awareness that we're talking about, if we separate that question from the very related question of, let's say, moral failings that are implicated, if we set aside the moral aspect and we just say cognitively what's going on, the guy is only very loosely in connection with what he's doing a lot of the time. I mean, how else could you have this fiasco with the 2 editions of the Key? So we have that. Now let's introduce something else into the mix. You know, there is a fact that is very hard to grapple with, that the contact experience, the abduction experience, is often very dreamlike. What does that mean? It doesn't mean simply that it resembles dreams. And when you talk about the lucid state, this is what it makes me think of. There are plenty of accounts where in an ordinary waking state in the middle of the day, a contact experience initiates and it acquires immediately this kind of dreamlike dimension. There's a story that tells. He has told me a story in the past where he was in bed asleep and his girlfriend was in bed reading next to him. She was awake. And while asleep, he was dreaming that a gray appeared at the foot of the bed. And after a certain point in the dream, he was awakened by his girlfriend kind of nudging him, and he opened his eyes and he sees a gray at the foot of the bed in the exact same way.
Yeah.
So you've got this total blending of the dream and waking state. Now, there are some people who try to say, oh, well, that's because there's a real world and there's an imaginal realm where, you know, things are much more fluid. So they create this dualism. I don't go in for that. I rather think that probably underneath everything is mind. And that unfortunately, a lot of these experiences participate in that. Now, getting to Strieber, I apologize for going on at length, but it's difficult to unpack. If you have a guy who has had a lot of these experiences from the beginning, and these experiences are these kind of mind state experiences that are not grossly physical, and if for personal, idiosyncratic, unique reasons, his way of dealing with or connecting to or managing those experiences is through the imagination, that vivid childlike imagination that we're talking about. Let's say that was just a part of the kid from the beginning. Maybe it was involved, maybe it was in some way a consequence of the supposedly traumatic experiences. Put that aside. Let's just say that it was there. So if his route to these experiences and if his way of managing them cognitively is through the faculty of imagination, and if that faculty dries up normally in normal people by the time you reach adulthood. But in his case, he's tried to keep the door pried open a bit. And, and then on top of that, you have the fact that the guy gives himself this psychological and public mission as a result of his imaginative apprehension of these experiences to bring this truth to the public. You have this tangled knot where everything is tied into everything else and nothing can be cut. Nothing will, you can't unravel it. But the question of imagination is germane to what you were just talking about. He is someone who lives in his imagination, and for that reason, he can go and do the Gurdjieff work for 10 years, 12 years, however long it was, and somehow still remain immune to it. Because he's living in his imagination the whole time. Sure, he's absorbing things intellectually. He does that because then it will help him with his, intellectual ego pretensions later. But in terms of that kind of psychological cognitive reorientation that comes with the work, he's totally immune to it because the guy has one foot in this imagination, this door that never closed to begin with.
One thing we can say about Strieber, I think, quite categorically, is that he does experience, or he doesn't suffer from profound alienation from his own physical body and his emotions. I mean, we've touched upon the issue of sexuality for him, but I think in this regard, he classically suffers from, he's symptomatic of narcissism as described by Loons. But ironically, too, is that he's a classic instance of what Gurdjieff saw was the unharmonious or disharmonious development of the average Westerner, which is to say that their intellectual faculties are developed at the expense, and they're developed at the time when the emotional and physical dimensions are trophying. So as a result, the Gurdjieff work does actually focus on its actual practical aspect is on developing a relationship with the body in order that you begin to fundamentally locate yourself in space and time, that you can actually see who you are, not what you think you are. And repeatedly in our discussions, we find that with Strieber is that there's an imposition of imagery upon its existence. He's a great public intellectual, so on and so forth. He's the authority on this experience, so on and so forth. He is the voice in the wilderness. As a result, everyone's laughing at him, so on and so forth. This is all the imposition of imagery upon experience, and it just doesn't match up. It doesn't correspond. Interestingly, at this point, I have to say that Loons said, narcissism is largely incurable. And he thought up to 1 in 3 people in modern society suffer from this. Equally, or in that regard, I do see something very interesting, and it's a point made by a friend of mine, is that Strieber has interviewed Robert Bruce repeatedly. As you know, Robert Bruce has written much about astral travel and about the capacity of the mind to create experience and the capacity of the mind to mold that lucid experience. Yet he very seldom, or it never, tries to match his experiences against some of the ideas that Bruce brings up. And one of those is that your own capacity of the mind to convince itself of the reality of what is a dreamlike experience. So, you spoke about somebody seeing gray at the end of the bed and what have you. This is very much a par for a lucid experience or a lucid dream where you awake from it and are convinced it has happened. But as you wake more and more, you're less and less convinced it happened. And what you're left with in memory then is just a continuum of where you're convinced it has happened to where you're not sure it happened at all. And of course, what does that remind you of? Strieber's account of the key. Which, having said all of that, for someone who has such intellectual pretensions, I'm amazed that Strieber doesn't direct his much self-vaunted intellectual capacities to the subject that is himself.
Well, as you said earlier, and this is something I think also, who can? I mean, these are two things that are simultaneously true, and the power of each shouldn't be diminished. It is true from your perspective and mine that Strieber should turn his lens on himself pretty obviously, and that there's an urgent need for this. But at the same time, I think it's also true that no one can bear to do that in the way that it should be done. So, it's, I do have some compassion in that regard, at the same time that I'm utterly incensed by the absurdity of blind spots and their effects, the blind spots that he has about himself and the effects that those blind spots have on the discourse, whether it's just simply the discourse about him or on his website, so on and so forth. There's only so much you can ask in that regard. For someone to be totally self-transparent about himself or herself, I've never seen it. I've never seen it done. On the other hand, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. When it comes to the key, well, it's just such a massive can of worms. But that's the prime example from my personal point of view of something so absurd and ludicrous that it makes Strieber and his work unworkable. Now, it is true that a lot of these experiences have, for lack of a better term, the dreamlike quality, and that just as dreams represent a discontinuity with our waking life and therefore disappear from consciousness, these experiences do the same. It's as if they cannot take root in the everyday waking world, and therefore they dissipate, they evaporate. That's not to say that these things are dreams, but it's to say that there's something about them that behaves in the same way as dreams. Now, the thing about Strieber and the key is his refusal to admit that the experience later on, his refusal to admit later on that the original experience had that same quality. If you look at his early interviews and his statements right after the supposed event, you find all of these weird, baffling anomalies about how the master of the key was only 4 feet tall and he wore a military uniform and he had a long pointed face. And he's basically describing one of the visitors. And you have the drinking of the thick liquid that doesn't appear anywhere in the conversation later. And you have a variety of different aspects, things reportedly said that don't appear in the later conversation. You have Strieber over the course of 2 years writing that conversation up, and supposedly on the basis of notes. Really, we've never seen the notes. So why give him the benefit of the doubt?
Yep.
In one case, he'll admit, it's just a few squiggles. Really? Well, perhaps that's true. But where did this conversation come from? The conversation did not come from that night, that can be sure. You've got Strieber saying at one place that the conversation or the event lasted 45 minutes. In one early interview, he says expressly, well, the encounter lasted what felt like 45 minutes, but looking back on the text now, it must have lasted at least 2 hours. Then years later, when I reported that a quick, rapid, breathless read-through of the entire conversation in the same manner that he described the master of the key speaking could not have taken less than 2 hours, Strieber denied it flatly and said it lasted 45 minutes. So, and that would be easy enough to determine. There was an audiobook version made of the key. I haven't listened to it, but I would suspect you could take the reading of the conversation, cut out all the other crap, and even compress it and say, okay, well, let's say 20 or 30 minutes of that is from a slow reading. Let's say it was much more rapid and quick. What would you still have? I would almost bet anything at that point you'd still have 90 minutes of conversation minimum in duration. So he consistently denies for it appears to be for psychological reasons. He denies that there was any slippery quality to this particular encounter, whereas he's admitted in other cases that there was such a quality. So what was it about this particular encounter that causes him to steadfastly deny that there was anything unreal about it? Well, there again, you can start to speculate. If you look at the nature of the encounter itself, you have someone coming from on high to speak to Strieber himself. And it so happens, it turns out later with some analysis, that much of what this person says is material that Strieber has already himself either thought of or written. And what does that mean? The bottom line means that someone with otherworldly authority comes down to Strieber, and because he's chosen Strieber, Strieber, of course, benefits from that authority. He gains authority thereby. And what are the ideas that are conveyed? Oh, well, they happen to be Strieber's ideas. Of course, here and there appropriated from Gurdjieff and Michael Talbot and Gnosticism and others. But they are what Strieber believes to be Strieber's ideas. Now, in the past, I have thought, well, maybe a lot of it's contaminated by Strieber, but maybe there are kernels of these real things that don't come from Strieber that we should continue to look to.
Yeah.
But as a practical matter, after a certain point, subjectively, you have to just say, well, what the hell would that be?
Yeah.
After you have this succession of instances where words, phrases, concepts, themes, motifs that were apparently original, you thought they were original in the key, when they're exposed to belong either to Strieber, his past writings, his past interviews, scientific literature, which we know he's constantly absorbing obsessively, from nearly the same time, the Art Bell radio show milieu where Strieber was participating. Which one is more plausible? And I would say that you couldn't say 100% for sure that there's nothing of the supposed master of the key in the book without examining every single idea, knocking it down. And you couldn't say for sure that there's nothing of someone else in there without literally knocking down every single idea as Strieber's or not. But in the absence of that demonstration, what are you going to believe? Well, for me at this point, it's impossible to believe that there's anything that's in the book that isn't Strieber. Although I admit it's not conclusively proven.
I think, at this point, I'm really forced to return to what drew me to the key and why, for a long time, I did accept it as a true encounter, as the Tarsha subtitle goes. There are seemingly so many ideas so well expressed in either edition that seems to be beyond the capacity of Strieber. Even if it would seem many of these ideas or some ideas come from Gurdjieff or wherever, Strieber nowhere else demonstrates his capacity to so arrange and organize such disparate material. I think back on his series on meditation. He had a series of 9 meditations. They're all over the place. There's no schema outlined. There's no overall purpose, particularly posited in his overall description. But when I look at the key, I'm just I'm looking here at my own notes. He does have herein a superb machine quality description of the practice of what it is a human being is meant to do. And I'm with you in that a lot of this is found elsewhere. But my feeling is that there is another element, that something did happen on that night. Now, it may just have been some extraordinarily lucid experience that he subsequently misrepresented. But, even now, as I just cast my eye over some of the quotes, some of the elements of it, there is something that's not Strieber here, particularly in the description of the practice, of the balancing of attention, on the purpose of how to take in impressions. For me, that is pure. It obviously comes from Gurdjieff or parallels Gurdjieff very clearly, but still, it's articulated in a way that I think is beyond Strieber. It just is so superbly expressed that I still have the sense that Strieber did engage with someone or something that did possess a higher understanding. And you know, I'd be interested to hear, do you have a similar sense? Do you have a sense that there was something did happen, however unfaithfully subsequently represented?
Well, I would have to say a number of things simultaneously. I mean, I agree with you and what you just said about the material, its style, its presentation being very different than anything Strieber had previously or even since done in a way. I have always thought from the beginning that arguing for the text's authenticity is the fact that the material is so much smarter than Strieber. And just as you rightly point out with the meditations, I mean, he's obviously not an idiot, and he's not a person of even average intelligence. He's well beyond average, but there's no comparison between his own philosophical speculations as they appear in Communion and Transformation and other places, these kind of very small quasi-poetic speculations, and this dialogue, which is so perfect in terms of the economy of its expression and so on.
Yeah, its efficiency is extraordinary.
Yeah, and as has been pointed out elsewhere in the past, I mean, the text itself is so structured. I mean, it's not simply a question of the surface structure, which is beautifully well polished, which most fiction would be, let's face it. But underneath that surface, there are two things. Number one, when the master of the key speaks, he often leaves tantalizing clues and conceptual dead ends, and these suggest that there is this system known to him, a system of knowledge or a complete picture of the world, let's put it that way. He knows what the story is, but he's not always telling all of it, number one. And number two, when it comes to the style, not just the content, but the style of the expression, you have these associations between words that reinforce each other, which can create and convey implications that wouldn't be there otherwise, which is extraordinarily, I mean, it's difficult to achieve, I think, if you undertake it consciously. But, I mean, it's very rare and very effective. So you have these things arguing in the text's favor. That's one thing I would say.
I've long been excited by the fact that that layered meaning is apparent to other readers, because that was something that struck me on my earliest readings, is how terms would cross-reference each other to imply to imply greater meaning. And as we talk, I think too of one specific instance is if you look at treatment of the idea of vision and eyes and sight in the text, it parallels, or it's of a piece with the treatment of Gurdjieff, of the role of the eyes and their position as a subtle organ. Even this term, they would tell you with their eyes what you are. That's quite an obscure point in the Gurdjieff work, is that the eyes themselves reflect the energies absorbed by the taking of impressions. And this sort of description and this, you know, the intelligence I find present here is something I don't find present elsewhere in Strieber's work. That's something, again, I'm confused by. I'm also impressed by, even as Strieber talks about, when he talks about the master of the key, he says something that he talks about his delivery, and he makes this point on the nature of his delivery, how it's so that it's precise, it's authoritative, it's not muddled, he doesn't hum and haw. And of course, in his reading of the key, he does this impression. He speaks how the master of the key speaks. That, for me, is one creative flourish amongst many that, frankly, I think is beyond Strieber. To actually come up with that little flair, you know, to imagine and to try and persuade his audience
Well,
of your thought.
your thinking is entirely valid, but at the same time, if you go back to one of the early interviews he gave right after the supposed event, he was talking about how the master of the key communicated sometimes in strange sounds and noises, and in a very kind
Yeah,
of like hyperdimensional way. He would stop and
yeah,
then make a weird noise. Well,
yeah.
where's that in the transcription?
Right, and that's interesting. The guttural sounds. I think he uses this term, this guttural sounds, and for me, what has been maddening is I came across a similar account somewhere else. I've never been able to find out where. I can't remember where I read this before, but that exact thing in the delivery, and I think at one point Strieber even does an impression of it, where something's said and then there's this guttural after effect.
I've heard it. Yeah, I think I know what you're
Yeah,
talking about. A recorded
yeah,
in. Yeah.
right. And as I said, I've heard that described by another contactee, or I haven't been
Oh,
able to
by
find
someone
it.
else. I see. I see.
Yeah, that exact description. And I'm, as far as my memory serves me, it is a sort of guttural sound, whatever it may be, that sort of imposes an extra meaning upon what is said. I'm not sure what the possible linguistic effect could be. I'm not sure is there any understanding within everyday linguistics for how such sounds could convey meaning. But yeah, Strieber did say it was present, and as I said, I heard it elsewhere.
Well, again, there's a lot that could be said. I think, and I can only see it from a certain perspective that I've been given and then I give myself at this point. I think that it's time for a negative thrust against Strieber in this regard. And if you want to look at it in Gurdjieff terms, you can. If you see Strieber's work, the fact that it has never been critically evaluated by anybody in any real way as like the positive thrust, I think it's time for a negative thrust. That's one thing that I think happens to be true. I'm not necessarily wedded to any particular conclusion in a sense, because I think it's appropriate now for the whole issue of Strieber and the key together to really be given a critical examination. And even if theories or speculations or concepts that are done in the service of that turn out not to be ultimately true, that's okay. You know, I mean, you can always come up with theories or things to account for the issues with Strieber, but should you? And it's the should you which is the negative thrust, in my opinion. I mean, we're talking about the wonderful economy of expression and the style. Now, that was maybe the first thing that really bothered me about the so-called Tarcher edition. The fact that in so many cases, that wonderful economy was disrupted and it was replaced with something absurd. Now, most people, of course, you know, they read it on a superficial level and they aren't aware of the rhythm or the prosody or anything like that. So they're looking just in terms of literal content. The word refers to a thing. So they don't get that. But when you look at the Tarcher again and again and again, the wonderful economy that was there in the first edition is not there in the second. And then you say, well, why does this second edition even exist? And then you have Strieber's absolutely useless accounting for the existence of the differences between the editions. Well, then what do you do then? I mean, here you have, right? Let's backtrack and talk about what this book represents. Strieber represents and presents the book as finally, instead of these enigmatic, theatrical object lessons by the visitors that are so slippery and fluid and dreamlike. Finally, I had this perfectly human guy, he stresses, perfectly human, you know, entirely human guy come down who was, you know, so full of humanity. He just sat there and talked with me. He told me so many fascinating things that were so new, so completely new, right? So this is finally something that human beings can grasp. That is, on one hand, what this book is supposed to be. That's why it exists. This is from a human being who might have also been an angel, but he was really recognizably human, saying things for other human beings. presumably so that the statements could be thought about and understood and tested. That's why there's so many scientific pronouncements in there. Oh, well, you can use nitrous oxide, as a gas that will bear memory for artificial intelligence. So it's full of all these wonderful how-to type things, right? Practical knowledge of a very obscure sort. Well, when you have the differences between the editions, and then you have the total failure to account for the differences, and then you have the research uncovering that so much of either edition is prefigured or even almost expressly stated verbatim by Strieber in previous works or in lectures or interviews and so on. The whole thing becomes so problematic precisely as a piece of human knowledge meant for human consumption that, if that's what the book was supposed to be, you can no longer say that's what the book is. Therefore, now it's nothing.
Yeah, it's funny. I do think of what happened to the Gurdjieff work after Gurdjieff died. Gurdjieff made every effort to set his own pupils against each other. There was no single institutional form arose in his way. His magnum opus, Beelzebub's Tales, is almost absurdly inaccessible. Moreover, there are two competing editions, which I found quite a funny parallel. There are two editions, two translations. I wonder, again, do we come back to this issue? You give a message, you give an idea. The danger is that the people become enslaved to it and almost abject before this idea of a master of the key. Then you muddy the waters. You completely disrupt this image that has been, if you like, accumulating in people's minds about the master of the key. The effect is, it leaves them unslavish towards a possible master of the key, yet the ideas have been introduced, which is exactly what Gurdjieff did. The ideas are injected into the society. Then he ensures that who he was is basically an indeterminable. He leaves many of his leading students with a sense that they had a mission to complete. All of them are at odds with each other. As a result, the work perforce fractures. This is thoroughly in line with what Gurdjieff often said he wanted to do, was make people free and free of authority, to make them genuinely independent, thinking, feeling, sensing beings.
Well, it's a perfectly valid and legitimate possibility. Way back in the day when the controversy about the edition started, and I was more charitable about the whole thing, I wrote about that, I think, at the end of the one essay, where I saw in terms of that parable of the pig in the key. Where supposedly the pig has to be killed in order for God to get out. And the idea was that, I speculated at the time that now that you have this unresolvable issue, just as you yourself just said, the text itself can never become this object of veneration and holy writ, because now we've got different versions, and the ideas, they're diffuse now. Just like God being released from the body of the pig, now the ideas are out and the text itself is permanently compromised. But while that may well be true, the perspective I have today, at any rate, looking at the conversation in terms of discrete pieces and discrete ideas, is that too much of the conversation seems to represent questionable knowledge. To give an example, we have the superstorm scenario, and the idea is that the runaway global warming will actually trigger a kind of circuit breaker response, and the freshwater melt in the Arctic will push the Gulf Stream south, which will cause atmospheric temperature changes, which will lead to more stratification in the atmosphere, which will lead to these gigantic storms, which will result in so much snowfall and ice that it won't be able to melt, which means basically an ice age. Okay, so that, the first time I ever encountered the idea, I thought was phenomenally new. I mean, all you hear about even today is anthropogenic climate change and CO2 and global warming, right? And, in 100 years, there'll be no more Arctic, and the sea levels will rise, and, the coast will be uninhabitable. Even today, that's all you hear. Well, you go back and you find that in a couple of the science journals and popular magazines like Discover and so on, they were talking about this precise scenario. The whole thing, inducing the new ice age through global warming. Okay, now, one thing, though, that those magazine articles were very light on was any reference to methane.
Yeah.
And when you look at the key in the conversation, there's no mention of methane. Of course, there's mention of greenhouse gases, but there's no mention of methane. Now, with the kind of pedantic, Strieber-esque master of the key style, what you correctly characterize as machine-like, to my mind, you could not fail to mention methane, given that today they're saying, because it's 20 or 200 times more of a greenhouse gas than CO2, that it's going to really precipitate the end. And given these lurid events of these gigantic craters opening up in Siberia now, massive holes with methane supposedly coming, methane hydrate, whatever. Strieber, being Strieber, could not fail to mention that happening if he knew about it. And why didn't the master of the key also mention it? If this was a purely external event, this conversation with, totally new knowledge. So there's an example of Strieber not knowing something because it wasn't known at the time. And what do you know? The master of the key doesn't. You look at these precise details and you find that again and again, they are limited and sometimes simply wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, you have Strieber talking. He had the master of the key say that, light from other universes, has not reached you yet. So he's creating a scenario in which there's constant expansion, contraction, Big Bang, expansion, collapse, and that there are other universes in the firmament, the term that the master of the key uses, doing the same thing. And, maybe at some point, light from another universe will reach us, suggesting that there's a separation in space between one universe and another. Since that time, Strieber has completely abandoned that cosmological model. And now it's all about brain theory for Strieber, that other universes inhabit the same space as ours, just slightly, off kilter in another direction. Why that change? Why that change if he's already got the master of the key telling him the truth to begin with? You know what I mean? But I would think that really what we're getting from the master of the key in that description is something that was in Strieber's thinking at the time, because it was in the popular scientific thinking at the time. And now that the popular scientific thinking has changed, Strieber's thinking has changed. So when you encounter instances like that in succession, you begin to wonder really whether there's anything that is genuinely new, despite the style and so on. And then you have to give an alternate explanation for the distinctiveness of the style and the economy of expression and that sort of thing.
Again, we're arguing every side of the street here, but that efficiency of expression, or that economy of expression, that machine-like quality, it's when anyone can realize it with sufficient attention. He had 3 years to sit on the text, 3 years to come up with this. I think if so challenged, many people could produce such expression, could write with such, muscular efficiency. I've seen it in the work. I've seen people express themselves so. But there's something trouble to me, just as we're talking, you're talking about Strieber here presenting information he got clean from elsewhere. The master of the key posits a three-bodied model of humanity: an elemental, an energetic, and a radiant body. Now, the idea that human being possesses many bodies is commonplace within spiritual thinking. However, I cannot find anywhere that has a 3-body model of the human structure. Gurdjieff holds a 4-body model. Vedanta is a 6-body model, not 3. This idea of an elemental and energetic body exists nowhere else.
Well, I would just say you have to be careful in how you arrange the terms. I mean, the text in the Key does explicitly say that human beings have 3 levels of mind and vestiges of a 4th. And to my thinking, if you wanted to be precise, more precise, I would say that the book, the conversation really says that there are 2, the elemental and the energetic. Within the energetic, after a certain threshold, you have the radiant, but the radiant does not cease to be energetic. You know, when the soul is able to inhere and maintain itself, the power of attention, and at the same time increase its spin to the point of ecstatic superposition with the rest of creation, now you're in the world of the radiant body, but it never stopped being energetic. When Strieber talks about the 3 and the 4 levels of the brain, as he's done elsewhere in his journals, he's talking about brain structure. So what he's saying is you've got your reptile brain, your mammalian kind of secondary brain with the emotional centers. You've got the 3rd level, which is the frontal and the gray matter, and then the vestiges of the 4th, which is, of course, we're talking now about the pineal gland and the whole electromagnetic body, which, you know, we can perhaps train ourselves to tap into again.
Yeah, you know, I don't think in the Key the 2 ideas are joined between the mind and the bodies. And for what it's worth, this is quite similar to Gurdjieff's treatment of centers and bodies. They're not actually mapped on. The linkage between the 2 is obscure typically in the treatment. I suppose the one thing I was kind of getting at is that, or what strikes me is that the sort of 4 identities available to man are elemental, energetic, radiant, and of course God. I mean, that's the final, the ground and the totality of being. And what I was just pointing out is that I haven't found that treatment elsewhere. I find that interesting. I mean, Gurdjieff points to 4 bodies and God. Vedanta is 6 bodies. I'm not sure if I'm repeating a point here needlessly, but I'm not sure how to understand that within the Key, because Strieber himself doesn't strike me as a particularly innovative spiritual thinker. I don't find him elsewhere coming up with such ideas, yet the Key is obviously infused by them. As for the 3 levels of mind and the 4th level, Strieber's taken it as interesting, but it seems to be a bastardization of what you find in the work. The vestiges of a 4th, which I'll just come to, the idea of a 4th level of mind comes from the balance of the 3, which is the physical, the emotional, and the physical, which is in line with the full and active operation of the nervous system as it's found throughout the being. The reason for its failure to operate effectively is given by Gurdjieff as the existence of what he enigmatically calls organ kunda buffer, which is, like the master of the Key says, that part of your brain was switched off, or he uses words to that effect. Both Gurdjieff and the master of the Key advance, which is quite the unique idea, that something was done to humanity to stop his effective function. Nonetheless, or rather, the significance of all this for me is I find this presentation in the Key is it's almost, I find, beyond Strieber, but there it is. There we have it in the text.
Well, that's what we keep coming back to, right? The difference, the interval between Strieber and what appears in the Key. And you're not wrong to keep coming back to that. To my mind, for what it's worth, at this point, I think that it is really just a reflection of deep imagination. We forget today that things like Beethoven's symphony can be written. You know, there are things which are technically perfect and seemingly totally original. These things do appear, not often today, though.
Yeah.
And when you compare the Key to the rest of Strieber's work, I fully concur. I mean, it's night and day. There's no comparison. But how do you account for that? On the one hand, you can get into a very technical discussion of the ideas presented inside. And in that vein, I would say that really, and I've tried to avoid this because I'm more interested in authenticity issues, but you can see the whole model that Strieber presents of the soul and the soul's conscience and all that as really lifted from Gurdjieff. I mean, we know it really because you've got, for example, the idea that in Gurdjieff, you can, through the power of attention, you know, accumulate these impressions which, through their accumulation, create a kind of substance that is a person instead of the person just floating around the wind and having no substance, you know, just flitting from one impression to the next.
Yeah.
So if you interpret it that way, then you go to the Key and you've got Strieber saying, well, through the power of attention and meditation, you can gather these impressions. Oh, and just like, you know, the I in Gurdjieff, this time it's you can reincarnate with memories of yourself. And you can hold yourself together after death and all of that. So he basically makes it, he takes Gurdjieff and he turns it into something supernatural. Now, I can't, you may take issue with it, I can't demonstrate it exhaustively, and I'm certainly no expert on Gurdjieff. It would be a technical discussion that would require a lot of demonstration. But my point is that, you know, if you set that aside and you look at the question of authenticity, how you account for the difference between Strieber's general intellectual output and the Key itself, you're not, in my opinion, limited only to saying that this is so far beyond Strieber it has to be authentic. Because when you trace the ideas, too many of them, in my opinion, come from Strieber himself previous to the conversation for there to be much cause to say they're all rooted in some external event. So then what's the alternate explanation? I think he was so convinced of the reality of the encounter that he plumbed the depths of his own mind and he achieved something artistically that he had never been able to achieve before. And maybe there was an external event that happened. But what can we meaningfully say about that? If everywhere in the text we look for the master of the Key and find only Strieber in 1995 or 1989, then what can we meaningfully say about the master of the Key or his message? If we say, you know, well, what does the master of the Key look like? And in 2001, he's 5'8" and he's a Canadian wearing a turtleneck. And in like 1998, he's 4'8". He's got a long gray-like face. And he's wearing a military uniform. Well, then what does he look like?
Yeah, and you're still, I mean, even as we sit here and we talk about it and consider it, that even some of these creative flourishes, are they really that beyond him? If he given enough time and effort and energy, could he not come up with them? I mean, his journals, from time to time, he writes extremely well. He does, he does hit the sweet spot. He can actually put together paragraphs which are very well composed. He can write with real insight and verve and intelligence. So maybe just with the Key, that's all it is. He thinks he's inexperienced. He gives himself 3 years to pull it together. You could take it as an excellent, you sit down for 3 years, come up with a conversation. Maybe anybody could. And
well, the right subjective conditions have to be in place. But I think, yeah, you're right. In principle, anybody can, because there are channeled works by people who don't have Strieber's intelligence, who they, like the Seth material. I haven't read
Right.
it all, but you've got fairly technical and arcane observations in the beginning of the Seth material about the linearity of linguistic communication and so on. I'm like, well, how did this person come up with this? Well,
Right. Jane
yeah,
Roberts, an artist. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had the same impression. I was amazed at what she came up with. And for what it's worth, forgive me if I'm diverting your point here, but there was someone who wrote to Strieber, and he claimed an encounter with a similar being, if not the same being, where that person recommended to him the Seth work. And even tells a story how he sat there in his living room, and this being telepathically or telekinetically floated these books off his shelf towards him. Yeah, it's. I was in contact with that guy for a while, and he did that. He did that an interesting touch to that story. He said, as the man did this, he bumped the two books against each other, and they fell right to the floor, which I thought was quite a detail. But yeah, sorry, I've interrupted.
no, not at all. No, I'm not sure what other point could be made on that. I mean, from my personal perspective, I feel like I have to pursue, if I pursue it at all, I have to pursue this negative thrust as far as I can with a demonstration of all the various issues, because to my mind, it's incomprehensible in one regard, and it's also an outrage in another that it hasn't been done. And that, to me, obviously comes from the fact that Strieber doesn't really have any attentive readers. But more so, I mean, it begs the question, well, where the hell is Strieber in all this? And as I told you in emails before, I mean, as far as personal things go, there's a personal itch to scratch, because in coming to this material, like Strieber perhaps, I thought that I could contribute something by bridging the gap between Strieber and intellectual culture. I don't have a PhD or anything like that, but I did for a time at least have a talent in analyzing texts and writing about it and that sort of nonsense. So I thought, well, here is a great opportunity. But I found myself thwarted at every turn by all sorts of absurdities, often coming from Strieber himself. So I'm saying all this simply to say that I have to personally treat certain things as if they are solid in order to pursue them to their logical conclusion, even though other alternative explanations may well be possible. Like, look at the grunting thing, the guttural sounds thing. I mean, we could, if we wanted to, posit that somehow Strieber required those 2 years to translate. If somebody gives you like a guttural noise that's like full of concentrated meaning, and you have to unpack it into human language and capture the proper nuance and put it in the right balance proportion, certainly that would take 2 years. So we could, if we wanted to, see this from a lot of different ways and continue to defend Strieber. And we could also, if we wanted to, go in for there being a true encounter. But so I'll say something which may be a little bit off the beaten path. I don't like drawing too many strong parallels, but as you can tell from some of the things I've said and also put into email, I've been paying attention a lot recently to discussions about the history of early Christianity. I'm not a Christian by any means, but it intrigued me in part because of the key. You've got Strieber in there injecting Christian theology, not only implicitly, but expressly, when he claims Jesus Christ was seen after his death. This is part and parcel like Catholic textbook theology, right? Jesus was seen. He appeared. He appeared to all these different people in all these different forms. This is gospel. And Strieber's got the master of the key saying, yes, Jesus was seen. Of course, Jesus was really a kind of a super Gurdjieffian who could project himself, but even so, he was seen. Therefore, Christian and Catholic dogma is correct in that respect. Well, then I listen to all of these shows and read a little bit about early history, and there are all these people who have a lot of good arguments for what they call the Christ myth theory, which is better expressed as New Testament minimalism, which, they painstakingly go over all of the extant texts, and they say, well, how much of this is historically corroborated? What can we say with any kind of confidence historically happened? And, piece by piece by piece by piece, they find everything is problematic. Every text has been rewritten and rewritten by multiple authors. They're full of anachronisms, referring to events that happened far later, little subtle hints to the reader, this sort of thing. So it gets to the point where these people, for example, say, well, we can't really say any of it happened. Whether it happened or not, we can never say. But probably it didn't happen because none of the texts support it. And the events on their face, miracles and so on, probably didn't happen. So when I look at Strieber now, and I look at the problem with the texts and accounting for the differences and all this kind of crap, and I find that, again, piece by piece by piece, things in the Key are already written by Strieber in other books, or they're in the news and so on. And then we have Strieber and the problem of the imagination, right? So when the drones are a big news story, Strieber wakes up in the early morning hours, looks out his window and sees a drone. And when it comes to the noises, the noises coming from above, the strange trumpet sound, sure enough, Strieber hears it. And are all of these things true? I mean, is he really so important that every new paranormal event that occurs also has to be experienced by Whitley Strieber? Well, I don't know. You can't say no, but at the same time, I doubt it. So you've got him imagining things, putting himself at the center of these new events when they occur. You've got all the psychological reasons for supposing there was this master of the Key who would show up, who gives a lot of important truths that happen to be all Strieber's own ideas, or at least enough of them to make you wonder. Finally, subjectively, like I say, objectively it's not proved, but subjectively, what do you do? Well, I've had to disengage from the text and from Strieber and from following him, because to me, all that investment that I put in before, obviously it wasn't rewarded, right? So I apologize for going on too long about it, but that's kind of where I'm coming from to explain the broader context of some of these positions.
Yeah. I mean, there was one, I'm sorry, but in what you said, there was one point in particular. It was a point you made quite early. You're talking about the confirmation of the resurrection. This is interesting, and we're moving off the beaten path, but I've heard of this. I've heard of this exact occurrence in the context of the death of a highly developed human being, which gives rise to the problem in analyzing the Key or Christianity or any spiritual text of from what perspective do you analyze it? From what stage of development, to use a lazy term, are you coming at the text from?
Well, I tend to see that issue in this way, and that is when trying to evaluate the truth or falsity of something, typically the human mind, by its nature, by its design, has recourse to other criteria, right? So if somebody comes up to you and tells you something fairly outrageous, there's no way you can evaluate it if you didn't see what happened. You could flip a coin and choose at random. Typically what happens, though, is that a human being will have recourse to the other criteria. Is someone thoroughly trustworthy? If yes, then maybe then you believe them. Is someone betraying physiologically these reactions that would only happen with a real event? If so, then you believe them, and so on. So you have recourse to these other criteria. Now, the Key, as a book, as a creation, seemed designed to give people these other criteria. So, for example, we already talked about the fact it's not enigmatic, pictorial information from gray beings, but instead it's, very kindly, gently spoken by this wise man, and it's written down and so on. And we have all of these places in the text where, it reinforces itself, refers back to itself implicitly, So you have all of these signs that lead you to believe that you've got this other criteria to use. When those other criteria, however, start to come down, you're left with the same coin flip that you had to begin with. Is it true or false? Well, it's 50-50, right, if you want to use a coin. So, I mean, I take your point as I think I understand that on the one hand, if you come to a text like this from a very primitive perspective, like most people approach the UFO issue, you know, if you know, or if how they approach Strieber, they'll look at Strieber and say, oh, well, he doesn't fit my exact concept of somebody contacted by aliens, therefore he's full of crap. Well, if you come at it from that stage of development, then, you know, you're going to be shortchanged. But at the same time, you can approach the issues of authenticity surrounding the key from not necessarily the same primitive perspective, but you can still look for other things to support, to corroborate, in order to justify having one perspective or another. And if those things are no longer present, or, you know, if they suggest a kind of unending series where they are all knocked down, then it has to change your opinion. At least it seems to me. It will at least be useful to pursue a perspective where you go through the text and you go as far as you can with it, expressing its problems, just to see, you know, whether some good comes of it.
Yeah, and I think with that exercise, I'd be most surprised if Strieber did not ultimately respond. That if you did produce, as as you've called it, a really pronounced negative thrust against the claims for his work, that he wouldn't respond to that. That would be most revealing. It'd be fascinating to hear what he'd have to say for himself. Yeah, I mean, in terms of if I can just come back to the the claims in the key, there's a lot of discussion of spiritual realities, and I mean, these in and of themselves have to be ultimately testable. This is a text, and it's a wise man, and he's trying to deliver certain ideas, and he talks about the structure of man, the purpose of man, and what is interesting, in that is that he does at once point to that intermediate spiritual goal of developing the astral body, as is Gurdjieff, which is a unique demand of the Gurdjieff work as a spiritual discipline. Whereas at the same time, he does include what are called like just pointing out instructions. You are God. Look into a child to see God there, and all this is present there. For me, that is all. They're all testable claims, which in itself that does for the authenticity of the text. And what I'm trying to get at, obviously in a roundabout way, is that his description of the bodies of man doesn't gel with any description found anywhere else. Now, I can't confirm one way or the other whether it's true or not. But what I know is that there's distance in his treatment of the structure of man. There's distance in his treatment of the energies we're subject to between that and which is established firmly in any number of spiritual traditions.
Well, it's a question mark. But, I mean, there are bound to be, and there are bound to be many that they shouldn't be dismissed, but at the same time, they can't be answered until there's an answer for them. There are things that will appear to be novel and perhaps are novel in the text. And on a related point, perhaps you were getting toward this, but it's occurred to me also that just because the text is not authentic, if we decide it's not authentic, doesn't mean that individual things said in the text are automatically false. For example, it may be true that you can observe the dead using, or at least detect the dead using instruments, and then by going into state of meditation, communicate with them. Or it may be true, a variety of claims in the text may be entirely true, simply because Strieber saying them, even if we suppose that he's invented the whole thing, ultimately it's an invention. It doesn't mean that anything is factually false. But it would depend on case. It's testable. It would be case by case.
You know, now that we talk about that, do you remember the page of links that used to be on the Unknown Country website? I don't know
what.
He had just links to other websites, links to websites of interest. One of those was to the electronic voice phenomenon. There were people who were studying this just using basically standard recording equipment in certain locale, and they were picking up voices, disembodied voices, and receiving messages from them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's always seemed to me that that's what he was getting at with that. It was a clear, but the book is full of those. That's the thing. I mean, you've got when the Master of the Key talks about these glorious children being born among you now. Well, in the Art Bell New Age circles, you had the indigo children.
Right, yeah.
And but then there are issues with some of these, right? So you have Strieber saying that there was this war between the worlds and that Mars was murdered. Well, as I pointed out somewhere else, Strieber has separately claimed that this title, Mars was murdered, it's a very distinctive phrase, was the title of a discussion thread on a CompuServe internet forum that he was on in the 90s or something like that, when they were talking about a past civilization existing on Mars because of the Mars faces on Mars was murdered. So now he's got the Master of the Key saying Mars was murdered. Well,
but wasn't that also in the communion letters, where off the top of my head there was someone in France met and
dead forever.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
No, I've got that. Yeah, that was in an early essay too, when I first started to kind of get a sense that maybe something wasn't quite right. That you've got, I think it was in the communion letters, but you've got him reporting on Dreamland at any rate of them having received a letter in which people are in the woods, like two people walking down a path in the woods, and some being comes out, starts telling them how there was a war and that mankind lost, but that he was a rebel and he was fighting, and that as a result of the war, even though the other group was wiped out, mankind was now called dead forever because, the mind was put to sleep or something along those lines. Well, there you have a motif, a very distinctive thing that Strieber is separately saying came from elsewhere. And now you've got the Master of the Key saying, oh, well, God calls you dead forever.
Yeah.
Did you know, for example, the whole thing about this electromagnetic organ being just like a centimeter outside of the body and so on? The whole thing in the Key about specifically this organ, electromagnetic organ, being like a centimeter above or a millimeter above the skin. Yeah. Did you know that that's discussed in length using the exact same language in The Secret School?
Yeah, honestly, I don't remember that.
Well, it's okay. I mean, if I had the copy in front of me, I'd pull it out. But what's even more interesting, and you can interpret it any way you want, is when you get to the audiobook version of The Secret School, that part disappears. But in the print version, I think maybe even in the last chapter, he's going on using the exact same language, discussing it as an organ. Now, when you get to the Tarcher version of the Key,
right? Yeah, I just want to add something there. When I said I don't remember that, my memory is from the audiobook.
I
read the print copy maybe 10 years ago. Gave the book away, and the last time it was on the audio copy, and that's why I said, oh, I don't actually remember that. It's interesting, anyway.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, sometimes they cut the boring material out for the audio book, but you don't know. There's no way to tell. But in any event, apparently, in the print version, which I no longer have, because all my books are in the U.S., but it's in there. And, I mean, verbatim, basically. So, there again. I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, that's a very distinctive novel thing, and you would think, as I did for many years, that there's no way Strieber could come up with that himself. That's way too precise and weird, yet possibly scientifically true. But then there he is talking about in The Secret School. And again, there are many, many instances of that. You've got I mean, I've got a bunch of different notes in different places with this sort of thing, but I'm sure you get the idea. But major pieces that in the beginning you would think have to speak to the authenticity of the text, or at least the encounter. Later you see Strieber's already in on it. It's a muddy issue, because then you say, well, what if it's the visitors? What if the whole Master of the Key thing were a theatrical object lesson, and the Master of the Key was kind of like a screen memory created by them, and that these lessons he's actually been accumulating his whole life, and that now this Master of the Key encounter is just a fictional staging, thanks to which he is able to unload in a very convincing and organized way all of these truths that really are true because of the visitors. Well, it could be, on the other hand, you have to wonder in yourself why psychologically you'd reach that kind of conclusion. It's like, well, we no longer have the Master of the Key's authority, so let's use the visitors as authority. So you're going out of your way to find some foundation for the text. I think in the end, the only thing that's honest, at least the way things appear at the moment, the only thing that's honest is to say that it's undecidable. And then when you consider Strieber's work in relation to other authors and other works, it's undecidable in so many different directions. And you're like, well, what the hell can I do with this after a certain point?
As a thought experiment, you can consider, how people, if you were to introduce this work to anyone with modicum of intelligence and a certain just literary capacity to read and absorb the text, how would they react? You're not going to find Strieber reviewed anytime soon in any mainstream paper anywhere.
No, it's a done deal. Prior to the Tarcher edition of the Key, I thought Strieber was wrongly and unfairly excluded because he was too much of a visionary. The phenomenon was too unreal for people to deal with, since it was so far outside of their everyday experience and so on. But then when the Tarcher thing came out, and I saw the way that he handled it and all that, and then I realized more and more of the issues with the text, it just became totally unworkable. Prior to that, I had bought copies of the book and given them to people to see, because I thought, well, I bet you most of this is true, and here you go, and what are you thinking of that? I would never do that today. Never, not for a second. What the hell? What are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
But the one thing I wanted to say, though, is that about that the secret school business, is that Strieber, he's so full of crap, because in the Tarcher, in either the intro or the afterword, like, he tries to get outside of the criticism. He says at one point, well, it's true that prior to this conversation, I had given lectures, he says. I had given lectures on this idea of there being an electromagnetic organ, but I never put it together the way the Master of the Key did. He doesn't mention that he actually published it in one of his major books. He instead says, well, I gave some lectures or some talks where I speculated about it. But then you know what he does, the same old thing. He says, and the reason why is because I saw it in this scientific journal. And he gives the name of the journal and all that shit. And the article, and I found the article. And sure enough, it's from like the mid-90s. And it's got basically all the same speculations. And there again, every time Strieber comes up with a scientific article or an essay to support something in the Key, typically, it's, in my opinion at least, it's where he got the material. Because again and again, there's too often that sort of thing happens.
Did you ever read Ed Conroy's book?
I did.
Oh yeah, I never got my hands on it.
Well, it's harder than hell. Even in the U.S., it's hard to get a hold of.
What was his take on Strieber? What did he think?
Oh boy, right off the bat, I wish I could tell you a lot more. It's been several years since I read it, and there are a lot of things that impressed me at the time. Let me see if I can think of any of them. There are a lot of details, even germane to this question of the Key. There are things in there that relate to the question of authenticity. I remember that much. Certain things that were said and pronouncements made and so on. This Ed Conroy character tried to do like a middle-of-the-road treatment of Strieber. So it was very even-handed without much of a point of view. The only thing that comes to mind, I apologize for not being able to say more meaningful about it at the moment, but one thing that comes to mind that I thought was quite significant was that an interview, I think, with Strieber's mother. Well, a couple of things now, I think. First off, his mother said that he was crying all the time as a child. Like the kid would never stop crying. So he was like supremely emotional even then. Which you could say, okay, maybe it's the result of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it could be what we see today in Strieber's character. But more concretely, I believe it's said in the book, and maybe by the mother during an interview, that Strieber was really taken, and one presumes profoundly affected by the book by Arthur C. Clarke, Childhood's End. Now, if you haven't read it, that makes no difference, or if you read it so long ago. But what's really significant about that book is that the whole thing about the book is human evolution into some basic basically into a psychic being. The whole human, and it's really quite a book to read. It's very moving. If you haven't read it and you ever are looking for something to read, I'd recommend it. But I mean, the whole thing about the book is this world historical human development into this like cosmos ranging psychic species, midwived literally by this race that comes down. They appear to be demons. They're called the Guardians, and a lot of the book, you don't know what they look like. Maybe I won't spoil everything for you. But that book, when you realize that that was a big effect on Strieber's thinking, you see that behind a great deal of his adult work. And you think, oh, geez, how much, even on this deep level, this adult work, how much of that can we trust?
Yeah. Did Conroy ultimately find Strieber credible?
He interviewed a lot of people who had been childhood friends, family members, and so on, who, because there were enough of them who said so, confirmed that there were these strange events. However, a lot of these friends would say to him, oh, yeah, Strieber was obsessed with UFOs as a kid. And he would come in and talk about the spacemen who were getting him and all that sort of thing. On the one hand, you could interpret that as these people retroactively, writing into the past, Strieber's lifelong obsession with aliens based on his now publicly announced obsession with aliens. So maybe it's not 100% credible. But in the main, because of what people said, Conroy did not conclude that Strieber was full of shit. And then at the end of the book, of course, Conroy started to have his own weird events, like being followed by black helicopters and all that, which you get the impression finally clinched it for him that Strieber was telling the truth. He wasn't basically making it all up, because all of these weird events started happening to him as well. But I think that's more or less where the book left it at the end.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sure there's a lot more to it because it's a fairly dense book. In paperback, it's a small book, but the type was quite small, and there's a lot of material in it that's quite useful to have. The sense you get from the Conroy book is that he knew Strieber, but Strieber had been gone for a long time in New York and all that, and Conroy was in Texas, and decided that, he saw the opportunity. He could actually go to all these people that he sort of knew himself and ask them, well, how full of shit is Strieber? And the answers he got, they varied. No one said that Strieber was a liar, and a lot of them had very strange kind of weird stories about him as a kid and that sort of thing. And then by the time you get to the end, when Conroy's having his own weird and kind of frightening experiences, even though, the book's over, you get the sense that Conroy is convinced that Strieber's telling the truth, whatever that might mean. So you could see them after the book is over being much better friends than before. And I'm sure Strieber was keen to give Conroy every opportunity to kind of like vindicate him and to show that Strieber wasn't himself lying. Although there were many things in Conroy's book that you would never get from Strieber himself. Again, the specifics elude me because I haven't seen the book now in a couple of years, but It's everything from biographical information to anecdotal accounts, the things that Strieber. Strieber's always very keen to emphasize certain things and details, and he's always very strategic. He's always trying to win an anticipated argument with some critic or somebody else, and a lot of stuff therefore doesn't fit the paradigm for him. But that appears in the Conroy book, so it's very useful to have if you can ever get your hands on it.